our elected servants and start treating them that way. They're the people standing in between us and healthcare.
There's like a howitzer ripping through the progressive movement going, sell out shills, you're a good crook, fraud, etc. Like, hold on.
It's just not clear to me why this was also controversial, quite frankly, on both sides. I mean, it honestly just felt like a massive argument over how to not be that effective. I mean, more or less, both sides of the argument were saying, well, listen, there's no chance that their action or lack of action would actually lead to any major change in terms of getting universal healthcare or even perhaps move the conversation all that much. No one was suggesting that this was some major turning point for universal healthcare. So whatever you think about all the different arguments, it seems wild to me that there was almost like a life and death struggle online between people about this tactic when, again, both sides were admitting it wasn't necessarily the world's most pivotal event or action or activity, and it certainly wouldn't pass Medicare for All. It just seemed like a lot of heat and light over what was a relatively small idea. Quite frankly, to me, this all reflects a very unhealthy obsession by quote unquote progressives, however you want to frame that, with Congress itself. Congress as the main actor. For sure, Congress is where the laws are made, but it's not where the real power is. That's the for-profit healthcare industry, which, by the way, organizes itself certainly to pressure Congress, but also through a range of pressure groups, fake patient groups, advertisements, bought and paid for scientific studies, and so on and so forth. In other words, they have a strategy for which they use a variety of tactics. The strategy, profit over people. The tactics, all the things I listed before. So if we acknowledge that Congress is the front man, so to speak, don't we also need to realize that Congress isn't our main arena, or at least not yet, and that in fact, pushing them to do anything, or at least the results of pushing them to do anything, is basically dependent on their perception of the ability of those doing the complaining to do something about it after the fact in the next election. And the thing that really makes me say this, quite frankly, and why I view this as the myopia, is the timing of how it came down. While Force the Vote was getting off the ground, the biggest issue in the country was the stimulus, which had not yet been passed. Democrats were inexplicably making a big stand, especially in that last weekend before it was originally passed by Congress, making their big stand about giving more money to the Federal Reserve. A lot can be said about that. Let me not be detained. That was the big Democratic stance. Not increasing the amount of money in direct payments, where Bernie Sanders was trying to make a stand in the Senate basically alone. The only person he had really was this far-right idiot, Josh Hawley. So it seems to me, if there was leverage on Pelosi, it should have been to increase the checks from $600 when there was also the leverage of the government shutting down and the military not getting any money, which always moves votes inside of Congress. In that context, it does seem absurd that House progressives didn't seize on the Pelosi vote to make a similar stand, and it should be added, be seen as the people fighting hardest for the working class in this country. That would make sense. That I would understand. The force the vote around Medicare for All, as I was saying earlier, unclear to me about what the connection is between the tactic and the strategy of getting to Medicare for All. That's my biggest really point here. My biggest problem is that the excessive focus on the Congress as the leaders. Congress moves on money and votes. If you can deliver or take away lots of that, you're at least in the game, you're at least in the conversation. Outside of that, you're on the outside looking in. Despite the large percentage of support for Medicare for All, there isn't yet a true mass movement behind it. So the key right now is how to turn supporters into fighters. And there's no magic bullet to make that happen. Tactically, both sides are making important points about the need for building at the grassroots level, the importance of pressuring politicians, sometimes in ways that can be very uncomfortable, certainly for them, and means that your quote unquote friends have to have the fire put to their feet there. And that ultimately it's going to take a mass movement of millions of people. The real question is, what needs to change in order for us to get to Medicare for All? And yes, one of those things is better, more effective, more aggressive representation at all levels of the political process. But there's obviously a lot more to it. When you have an idea that has 70% support in the country or something like that, and almost no support in Congress, it tells you there's a long way to go to motivate and to mobilize and to move people forward. And we have to ask ourselves not, should we force the vote? Should we not force the vote? I think we we have to ask ourselves, how do we build that movement? What are the various things that are going to reach people and going to move them at all the various pressure points? What are the connection between those things? And certainly between those things and forcing the vote, which I would include within them. How do we connect the range of tactics to the mass outrage and the obvious need? That is the kind of conversation we need to be having. That's the substance of how we move to Medicare for All. Instead, it seems like there is just 4 weeks or so, maybe it was a little more than that, where you had two sides of people who basically agree and certainly agree on Medicare for All, arguing like they wanted to kill each other over the tactic rather than the strategy to move us from where we are now to where we need to be.